Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 6, Halacha 3. We're going to be getting into what happens when you're trying to plant underneath these grapevines. In the Art Scroll, we're on 57b2. In Chapter 6, Halacha 1, we had the minority opinion, which is not the Halacha, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and his position, and again, not the halacha, makes it look like in some context it might be possible to plant underneath these underhanging vines. In other words, what he was saying is that, look, these vines for the aris are not treated like individual vines, and that you have to do a setback of 4 amos from the planted vines, the trunks of the vines, and if you're taking these branches and bringing it over to the wall, as long as there's a distance of more than 4 amos between these branches and the wall, the distance that's extra between the 4 amos and the wall, you can plant underneath. That is not the halacha. But that would mean that, look, if you had, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's reading of this, 5 amos between the vines and the wall, and you're going to drape these vines on top of the wall, then in that context, you would be able to plant in that 1 amma space between the wall and this 4 amma area. That is going to be the idea in the minority opinion. That is not the halacha. Now we saw in chapter 6, halacha 2, another case where you have an embankment that's going to be like a high part, and you have a wall on top of the high part, and a lower part you're trying to pick these grapes, and you can't reach them. Well, if you can reach them, they're saying that this is really going to be like a single planting area, and that you have to set back from the edge of the branches 4 amos. But in the case where it's too high to reach, you have to do it where you can never plant directly underneath these branches in the aris, but you can go to the edge of the branches and plant there. You don't need to set back 4 amos. Why? Because over there it's like 2 different planting areas. It's not really considered to be the same space. Now, in Halacha 3, we're going to get more into this prohibition about planting underneath the supports that are used to elevate the hanging grapevine. And that, by the way, is going to be the Halacha Lamaisa, that you really can't plant underneath the hanging grapevines. And again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's point, which is the minority opinion, was really a technical point about the nature of the aris and whether these might be treated like a vineyard, whether it's not a vineyard and maybe it has some special designation to it. And that, again, is not going to be the halacha lamaisa. Halacha lamaisa is going to be that it is treated like a vineyard, although, as the Ravad is saying, that it is going to be a d'Rabbanan vineyard. Now, the Mishnah here in Halacha 3 starts like this. It says, if one trains a grapevine over part of the lattice work of a trellis, he may not introduce foreign seed even beneath the remainder of the trellis. But if he did introduce foreign seed beneath the remainder of the trellis, it does not render the produce of the vines or of the seed forbidden. So what we see here is that we're treating the trellis like an extension of the grapevine, but that's going to be initial. And that's going to prohibit planting foreign seed beneath the trellis. But if somebody violated that rabbinic fence, no pun intended, and planted some foreign seed beneath the trellis, but not under the actual grapevines that are draped on top of the trellis, then it's not going to be allowed. But are you going to have to uproot it? No. Is it going to be forbidden for Kalei HaKaram? No. Is it going to make the vine forbidden for Kalei HaKaram? No. Is it going to make the seed forbidden for Kalei HaKaram? No. But you're not allowed to do it. But if you did it, it's done. In other words, this area is going to be prohibited rabbinically. And this is going to be where, we're treating, like, we're looking at Kilayim as a biblical ruling. And what we're doing is we're trying to create a fence to make sure it doesn't look like a Marasayan issue or anything like that. Now, if you have this vine that is going and being hung over this trellis, it's forbidden to introduce foreign seed underneath the entire trellis, but specifically under the area that is under the grapevine. Now, why are you forbidden, in theory, to put it under any part of the trellis? Well, the grapevines grow pretty quickly, and they're eventually going to grow onto the rest of the trellis. And then you're going to really have a problem. So the Mishnah is trying to teach that since the purpose of the trellis is to support the expansion of the grapevine, it's going to be deemed to be rabbinically subordinate to the grapevine, and it's going to be treated as an extension of the grapevine itself. And therefore, it's going to be prohibited, says the Rambam, to plant foreign seed even beneath the sections of the trellis over which the grapevine has yet to spread. Now, the law stated here is where if part of the trellis is supporting a grapevine, it's forbidden to plant under the remainder of the trellis, d'Rabbanan, and it is not limited to the case of these 5 hanging vines that, by the way, would form an arras. So even if you just had, says the Chazan Ish, a single vine that is trained onto a supporting trellis, it's forbidden to plant under the remaining part of the trellis. And the idea is, again, because the vines eventually will spread out to cover this trellis. Now, the Mishnah continues and says, if, however, the new growth subsequently extended and covered part of the trellis overhanging the foreign seed, then the produce becomes forbidden. So once this grapevine now extends over to cover the remaining part of the trellis, now you have the stringencies of Kilayim where foreign seed is now growing directly under an actual grapevine. And now, this biblical restriction kicks in. Now, before, what we were talking about is a rabbinic restriction, not to plant underneath this trellis. And again, it's splitting up the trellis into 2. You can never plant underneath the grapevine. But if you plant it under the empty part of the trellis, it's forbidden d'Rabbanan, but if you did it, it doesn't render it forbidden. Now, if the grapevine is going to grow over the seed, now you have a d'oraita problem. So that's why they put in this fence, because again, we have this, kalei karam issue with a biblical Kilayim stringency, and it is going to render produce forbidden now after the fact once it grows over to it. So the Mishnah is going to continue and say that the same law applies when one trains a grapevine over part of a barren tree, but if someone trains a grapevine over part of a fruit-bearing tree, it is permitted to introduce foreign seed beneath the remainder of the tree. In other words, that people do not subordinate fruit-bearing trees to serve as trellises to help the expansion and to help a grapevine to grow. And why would that be? Well, because the remaining part is going to be viewed as a separate entity, and it's going to be independent of the trained grapevine. And so in that case, you can introduce foreign seed on the ground beneath. Now, just like somebody would train a grapevine over a trellis and intend for this grapevine to proliferate and grow and spread over the entire trellis, one who's also going to be putting this onto a barren tree is going to intend for the grapevine to spread over the remaining part of the tree. So it's going to be deemed to be an extension of the grapevine itself. So in that case, you're not allowed to plant foreign seed even on parts that are yet to be covered. So it's going to really be like a trellis. But again, people are not going to be subordinating fruit-bearing trees to the grapevine, and that's going to be where this next part comes in. So it says that it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed beneath the remainder of the tree, and that again is on the fruit-bearing tree. And the Mishnah continues and says, if the new growth subsequently extended to overhang the foreign seed, he returns the vine to the original position and then is again permitted to plant under the remainder of this fruit tree. So the idea here, says the Chazan Ish, is not only is the already planted foreign seed permitted, and in this case it was planted there permissibly, but it is even permissible to plant new seed in the same spot, and we do not say that since the vine spread to those parts of the tree that overhang the foreign seed, that those parts are now treated like a trellis. Rather, once the new growth of the vine has been removed, it is now permitted to plant foreign seed there. And this, by the way, you can find in the Chazan Ish's book in Kilayim 13:1. But again, what is this doing here? This is playing with the idea that, hey, if I now cut back this vine, did I render the grain that I have under this fruit-bearing tree permissible again? Yes, because you cut it back. Now, the Mishnah is going to relate. And why would that be, right? Well, the idea is that this is, you desire to have the fruit-bearing tree. You don't necessarily want the grapevine to take all the sunlight and to destroy the fruit-bearing tree that's currently productive. So the grapevine in some way is going to be subordinate. Now, there's a difference between cutting back the vine on the barren tree, because the barren tree is going to be treated just like a trellis, and it's not going to be subordinate. It's actually going to be part of the grapevine. But the nuance here is that the fruit-bearing tree is not being entirely treated like a trellis, and it's not entirely being treated like a vineyard. So that's going to be the difference, where if you cut back over here, that this grain that's planted underneath the fruit tree is going to be permitted again. But it would be a problem if you left it there under the barren tree, because again, now you're violating the rabbinic fence that was put in, because eventually it's going to grow over the rest of the barren tree. It's going to make biblically the grain that you planted underneath the barren tree forbidden, and you're going to be ending up with a Kilayim issue, Deraita Kilayim issue. So the Mishnah now is going to get into a story, and it happened that Rabbi Yeshua went to visit Rabbi Yishmael in the town of Aziz. Rabbi Yishmael showed him a grapevine trained over part of a fig tree. Rabbi Yishmael said to him, "May I introduce foreign seed under the remaining part of the tree?" Rabbi Yeshua said, "It is permitted." Again, the idea is that, as we're learning here, one does not subordinate the rest of a fruit-bearing tree to the grapevine to be trained over it and to destroy your fruit-bearing tree effectively. Because again, these plants will compete with each other for sunlight. And one of the ideas here is that, we're covering in chapter 6, Halacha 2 and 3, is what is going to be the primary planting area, what is going to be the subordinate planting area. So the primary planting area is going to be the fig tree, and the subordinate area is going to be the grapevine. So in the case of the barren tree, the primary area is going to be the grapevine and the barren tree. That's going to be the issue. So Rabbi Yishmael then took Rabbi Yeshua from there to Bet Megina. So they went to a new town and showed him a grapevine trained over part of a beam. And it grew from a sycamore stump in which there were many other beams growing out of this sycamore stump. In other words, they trained this grapevine over one part of the sycamore stump that had many beams coming out of it. By the way, the sycamore tree we've covered in Masechet Shvius, because these are used to grow beams, and we use these beams for construction. And what would happen is they would take it, they would cut it down, and it would grow many, many beams out of the stump, and it would be used for construction. So effectively, this stump now has many beams that are growing out of it, many, many new trees effectively growing out of this stump. And basically, what we're seeing is that if you're hanging this on one of them but not the others, that's going to be the question. And, is this going to be treated like, a barren tree, or is it going to be treated like a non-fruit bearing tree? By the way, the sycamore does produce a very low quality fig, and the low quality figs come up in Shvius and also in Demai. And, the question is, what are you cultivating this for? Really, you're cultivating this for the wood. You're not really cultivating this for the fruit. I'm sorry, this is not in Shvius, it's in Masechet Demai. But the idea is that really, what do you desire this for? You're really desiring this for the beam, not for this low quality fruit. So that's really what's being asked. Is it really going to maybe look more like the barren tree instead of the fruit tree? And he asks again whether foreign seed can be planted under the remaining part of the tree, in other words, under the rest of these beams. And Rabbi Yeshua says back to him, under this beam, in other words, where the grapevine is currently trained, it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed, but under the rest of the beams, it is permitted to introduce foreign seed. Now, Rabbi Yishmael, says the Rosh Hashanah, is asking whether the rest of the sycamore tree becomes subordinate to the grapevine. And in that case, it would look a lot like the law for the overhead trellises that we were just covering. Now, the Chazan Ish is going to explain that planting underneath the entire branch, that's going to be prohibited, even if part of the branch where the vine has not yet grown becomes subordinate to the vine. And in this respect, the sycamore is now going to be similar to other barren trees. So the other part is going to be, well, what about the rest of the branches? And so although the sycamore tree is a barren tree, only the branch over which the grapevine is trained is going to become subordinate to the grapevine and prohibited for introducing foreign seed anywhere beneath it. But the other branches do not become subordinate to the grapevine. And the idea is that these are like individual trunks coming out of this original stump. And it's unlikely that the grapevine is going to get from here to over there. I think that's part of the idea. And, in regard to other types of barren trees, the individual branches are going to be treated like the entirety of a single trellis. But over here, you really have many stumps coming out of this original stump. And since it's only trained on one stump and not the others, then it's only going to be forbidden on the original stump. Now, the idea is that this is not being treated like a barren tree. Only the original stump that has the vine on it is treated like a barren tree. And now we're going to get into the term of what is a barren tree. And the Mishnah asks and says, what tree is a barren tree in this regard? And it says that any tree that does not produce fruit. Rabbi Meir says that all trees, even those that do produce fruit, are viewed as barren in this respect, except for the olive tree and the fig tree. Rabbi Meir is arguing with the Tanna Kama. Tanna Kama is saying that the barren tree in this case is defined as any tree that does not produce fruit, and only upon such trees that will allow a grapevine to proliferate is it going to be where a tree that produces edible fruit of any sort is going to be deemed to be a different significance than the grapevine, and they still might be valuable because the fruit grower, would want, say, both of them. And so people do not allow these fruit trees to become overhang with grapevines at the expense of the fruit they're going to produce, because you're going to end up destroying the entire tree. Now, if part of the tree becomes with a grapevine, then you can only plant foreign seed beneath the part that has the grapevine, not the remainder part of the fruit tree, because again, we value the rest of the fruit tree. But Rabbi Meir is going to be arguing. He's going to be saying that it's going to be any fruit-bearing tree except for the olive and the fig. And since most trees are less significant than a grapevine, people are not going to allow them to become overgrown with a grapevine. And here too, they're going to be treated like a trellis if it's on part of a tree, with the exception of the olive tree and the fig tree. And in that case, they're not going to allow it to become subordinate to the grapevine. Now, this is all going to be a parallel about an agadic thing about in Messianic times when the Jews start coming back from not observing Torah to observing Torah, from not knowing Torah and learning Torah to knowing a lot of Torah, and a proliferation in the world of Torah. And it's going to be like these trees that didn't have fruit are now going to produce fruit. And so there's also a connection between the grapevine, which is very agadic, and because vines and grapes are connected to Torah knowledge. Anyway, so there's a lot of agadic things in this Mishnah, and the rest of the Mishnah finishes up and says, Rabbi Yossi says that any tree species, the likes of which is not planted in whole fields, is viewed as a barren tree in this regard. So Rabbi Yossi has a slightly different view. Marafuld explains it like this, that Rabbi Yossi is maintaining that trees that are so significant that farmers are going to plant entire orchards of them, then these are going to be where you're not going to allow this to become a trellis. And you're not going to subordinate those fruit-bearing trees to a grapevine. But less significant species that are not cultivated in entire orchards can be used as a trellis for a grapevine, but when the grapevine is trained over them, it will only prohibit the plant that is directly underneath it. It's not going to prohibit all the area under the tree. Now, the Gemara is going to start on the first part of the Mishnah that's talking about the grapevine being trained over part of a trellis, and that foreign seed may not be planted even beneath the remainder of the trellis. The Gemara is going to try to understand the ruling as not only to the lengthwise extension of the trellis, but also to the widthwise extension of the trellis. Gemara reads that Hiskiah says the ruling of the Mishnah prohibits the width of the trellis, and that pertains only to the width extending from 3 tefachim to 4 tefachim beyond the vine. And the idea is that, let's say you have even a single vine on a trellis, the question is that, well, if you have only one vine, and are you going to preclude the entire length part of where the vine would extend into? That's what the Mishnah seems to be reading. But what about the width part? How wide is this vine going to go? And this is basically saying that it's going to extend from 3 to 4 tefachim beyond the vine. In other words, that you could assume that it will expand out widthwise only another 3 or 4 tefachim. And the Gemara says for the width that extends less than 3 tefachim beyond the vine, it's considered as though it's sealed. In other words, it's part of the trellis, and we're not going to distance it at all from the vine, and it's obvious that we can't plant foreign seed below it. In other words, that you have to make a 3 or 4 tefach setback from the current width of the vine and add on your 3 or 4 tefachim and don't plant underneath there. That's what it's saying. So the Mishnah is dealing with the width of the trellis that is from 3 or 4 tefachim, teaching that one must complete 4 tefachim from the vine before planting foreign seed. And when one leaves 4 tefachim of the trellis on the sides of the vine, the space is going to be enough for the vine so that beyond these 4 tefachim, one can plant foreign seed under the trellis. So when you're looking at your trellis, you can't plant foreign seed anywhere where the length of this vine would eventually extend into. But what about widthwise? Because these don't become very wide, so they become very long, but not very wide. So the idea is that you're going to take from where it is now, you're going to take 4 tefachim, and then you're going to seal that. You're going to say, okay, underneath this area, I'm not going to plant underneath this trellis. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about the length and now dealing into 2 different opinions about that. So it says, until where does the prohibition area extend for the length? Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish that the prohibited area extends until 4 almost from the end of the vine. And Rabbi Acha and Rabbi Hanina said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish that the prohibition extends until 6 almost from the end of the vine. In other words, that there's a maloket on what is going to be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And the rest of the trellis in this case is going to be deemed, when you're looking at the length part of the vine, as subordinate to the vine. And you can't plant in the ground below because the trained grapevine will eventually expand into the section of the trellis that is unplanted. Now, the idea is that in looking at the length, we're not going to make it an unlimited distance. It's going to be where you're going to determine, says the Vilna Goan, how far the vine will reach within a year. And so possibly, says the Chazan Ish in Kilayim 32:12 in his book there, that possibly these 2 opinions are going to be reflecting a lenient and a stringent estimation as to the projected growth of a vine in a year. The Chazan Ish says that the 4 or 6 amma limit applies in both regards to a trellis and also where it's going to be on a barren tree. And according to this reading of the Gemara, the second version is going to be talking about astringency. That's going to prohibit 6 amos instead of 4 amos. And there's going to be a related discussion about it. And Rabbi Manna says, I went to Caesarea and I heard Rabbi Hoshaya bar Shammai say in the name of Rabbi Yitzhak ben Lazer that if there were 2 separate trellises, one beyond the other, and a grapevine was trained over one of them, it is permitted to introduce foreign seed beneath the second trellis without a vine, even if the vine might eventually reach into the second trellis. Very interesting. So Rabbi Hanina is mentioning this dissenting opinion of a Baraisa. And why? Because we're talking about how far this vine could potentially reach in a year. And perhaps this vine might be able to reach the second trellis in a year. There's going to be an opposing opinion. Rabbi Hanina said that there was a Baraisa that cited the following, and it argued with the previous ruling in the other Baraisa, or not a Baraisa, this other opinion that was heard by Rabbi Hoshaya bar Shammai in the name of Rabbi Yitzhak ben Lazar. So basically, the idea is that this Baraisa is arguing and saying that if it is the way of the vine to skip from one trellis to the other trellis, then if the projected growth of the grapevine will expand onto the second trellis, it is prohibited to plant foreign seed even under the second trellis, because the 2 trellises are going to be treated and viewed as one. So the idea is that the previous ruling that Rabbi Manna cited was that it's permitted to plant under the second trellis in any case. Now, the Mara Fulda explains Rabbi Hoshaya bar Shammai permitting the introduction of foreign seed under the second trellis without a qualification. But there's a conflict with this Baraisa, because that Baraisa that's going to be cited and quoted in the name of a Tana is going to be in conflict with this Baraisa that talks about a case of a vine that might extend or might not extend over to the second trellis. So there's a Baraisa that's also cited, and the Gemara says that it was taught in the Baraisa. This is also going to be by a Tana, that Rabbi Shimon ben Lazar says that if it was the way of the vine to skip from one trellis to the other trellis, it is viewed as one combined trellis, and the foreign seed may not be planted under either trellis. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to look at Hiskia's statement here, and he's going to be saying that after citing the Baraisa, that the 2 adjacent trellises are going to be considered distinct unless it is the way of the vine to expand from one trellis to the other. So in other words, if you're going to be saying that, well, this particular vine might not actually expand onto the second trellis, even if it might be a trellis that's pretty close, then the second trellis is not going to be forbidden. So the Mishnah gets to the next part. The Gemara is going to get to the next part of the Mishnah, which was talking about training a grapevine over part of a barren tree. And the idea is that you can't introduce foreign seed even beneath the rest of the tree. And also the Mishnah talks about this and contrasts this with a grapevine that's trained over part of a fruit-bearing tree. Gemara says, if, however, someone trains a grapevine over part of a fruit-bearing tree, it is permitted to introduce foreign seed beneath the rest of the tree. The Gemara is going to explain the difference between the barren tree and the fruit-bearing tree. The Gemara says, what is the difference between the barren tree and a fruit-bearing tree? It says that a person subordinates a barren tree to his grapevine, but a person does not subordinate a fruit-bearing tree to his grapevine. In other words, the tree is already dead. You're just saying, oh, it's a trellis, it's going to help my grapevines to grow. In the other case, you're saying, well, it's attached a little bit to this tree, but I value the rest of this fruit-bearing tree. I don't want the whole thing to be covered by vines and killed off because it took all the sunlight. I actually want this thing to keep producing. So we have to look at what is going to be subordinate and what is not. In the case of the fruit-bearing tree, you value the fruit-bearing tree. You don't want the whole thing to be covered. And that's going to be why you can plant under the remaining part of the fruit-bearing tree. There's a related discussion. It says that we learned in a Mishnah, this, by the way, in Kilayim 26:4, that all tied leather flasks are tahor and are not susceptible to tuma except those of the Arabs. Rabbi Meir says that if the flasks were tied temporarily, they are tahor, and if they are tied permanently, they are tamei. And Rabbi Yossi says that all flasks that are tied are tahor. This, by the way, is very similar to the deathbed statement of what Rabbi Eliezer was saying when the sages visited him and he was dying, and they were asking him questions about tied leather flasks and if they're tahor or tamei, and the difference is going to be with the Arab one. The Arab one is going to be made with a knot that's difficult to open, and the idea is that it's not going to be undone, and the hole is going to be considered to be sealed, and that flask is going to be susceptible to tuma. Now, ordinarily, a tied flask is usually going to be perceived as being open, and that's not going to make it susceptible to tuma. But the Arab flask is going to be susceptible to tuma because that is how they are normally made. And on his deathbed, Rabbi Eliezer was ruling about these things, and he said that they were tahor, and then he died. You can find that story in Second Sanhedrin. So there's another version of Rabbi Meir's statement that is cited. And why are we dealing about this with flasks? In other words, how is this? What's the logic here? Why would a temporarily tied flask be more susceptible to tuma than a permanently tied one? And how is this going to connect back to what we're dealing with here on the tree? And it is going to be connected. So the other version of Rabbi Meir's statement is going to be cited, and it's going to be rejected, and I'm going to explain how this is connected to the Barren tree in a second. But there was a Tana who taught a reversed version of Rabbi Meir's statement as follows, where it says like this, that Rabbi Meir said that if the flasks were tied permanently, they are tahor, but if they were tied temporarily, they are tamei. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says in the name of Rabbi Yasa, the correct version of Rabbi Meir's statement is recorded in the standard version of this Mishnah. Now, the Gemara is going to look at an aid to remember the correct version of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yudan says that there's a mnemonic for remembering the correct version of Rabbi Meir's statement in Tractate Kilayim. That's going to be with our Mishnah in Kalim and Kilayim. So, in other words, Kalim, not Kilayim, but this is going to be the Mishnah in Kilayim. And our Mishnah is teaching that a barren tree which one subordinates to his grapevine is going to be treated as an extension of the grapevine. And the fruit-bearing tree, which you're not going to subordinate to your grapevine, is not going to be treated as an extension of the grapevine. And the same is going to be true with the case of a flask that is tied according to Rabbi Meir. In other words, a permanent knot, which one abandons to serve the flask, is going to be considered to be an integral part of the flask, whereas a temporary knot, which one does not abandon to serve the flask, is not considered an integral part of the flask. And just as this Mishnah is employing the principle of subordination over here with the tied flask, it's also going to be on the principle of subordination. So Rabbi Meir is going to be arguing that since in the case of a temporary knot, the strap is not subordinated to the flask, and over here, that flask would deem to be open and tahor. Whereas if you had this Arab one that is permanently tied, that's going to be subordinated to the flask, and it's going to render the flask repaired and susceptible to tuma. Now, over here, it's going to be saying, well, what do you want with this tree, this fruit tree? Are you going to be saying that, you're subordinating the tree or not? And so if you're saying that you're not subordinating the tree, then the rest of the tree can be planted with the foreign seed. And if you are subordinating the tree, like in the case of the barren tree, then it cannot be. So Rabbi Yudin is going to provide support from his assertion that the Mishnah in Kalim is going to be based on this same principle of subordination. And the Gemara says, for if not so, if not that the permanent knot becomes subordinated to the flask and a temporary one does not, what difference is there between a flask that was tied permanently and one that was tied temporarily? In other words, what grounds can there be for Rabbi Meir's distinction between these two kinds of flasks? And there's another opinion that's cited, and it says in the Academy of Rabbi Yanai, they said an alternate distinction between these two types of knots. It said that a flask tied permanently requires cutting to undo the knot, and the flask is therefore considered in the meantime as sealed. But the flask that is tied temporarily does not require cutting to undo the knot and is considered to be open even before it is undone and actually physically open. So accordingly, Rabbi Meir's distinction is not related to the principle of subordination. And so what this is trying to teach is that the Mishnah in Kilayim is not going to be comparable to our Mishnah in Kilayim. So that's going to finish it up. So really what this is trying to say with the students of Rabbi Yanai in his academy, they're understanding that Rabbi Meir's distinction between a permanent and temporary knot has nothing to do with the owner's intention to subordinate the tied strap to the flask. But with regard to sealing the two knots, that's going to be the issue. And so when one intends for a knot to be permanent, he ties it so tightly it can't be undone, except by cutting it. And as such, the hole is going to be sealed. Now, that flask is going to be susceptible to tumah. In contrast, when one makes a temporary knot, he intends to undo it. He doesn't intend to cut it. And he's going to make it so it's easy to undo. And this weak knot is not going to render the hole sealed. And that flask is going to remain broken. It's not going to be susceptible to tumah. And while the students of Rabbi Yanai are going to agree with Rabbi Yudin that the Mishnah's version of Rabbi Meir's statement is correct, they're going to dispute his statement that our Mishnah in Kilayim can serve as a mnemonic for the correct version, and they're going to maintain that Rabbi Meir's distinction between a permanent and temporary knot is not related to the distinction between a barren tree and a fruit-bearing tree in this Mishnah. In other words, that the Academy of Rabbi Yanai says that the version that we have here of Rabbi Meir's statement is correct, but he's not right on the logic. And the idea is that ultimately that there's no basis for comparing the two Mishnahs over there in Kilayim and over here in Kilayim about whether we're going to use a knot to seal the flask and if that's going to be the same as using for a support for a grapevine. In other words, the question is going to be, can you use this for subordination? The idea over here for this grapevine is this is a case of the principle of subordination, but Rabbi Yudin's academy Rabbi Yanai's academy is saying that the flask is not going to be a case of subordination. Have a great day.